Hi, it's Mr. Srikanth Palan here, and in this video we're going to look at how to find percentages of amounts. And to do that we're going to need to know how to find 10%, and we're going to use that knowledge of finding 10% to find other amounts. Now this is a non-calculator lesson, so this is about finding percentages of amounts without using a calculator. There is a separate skill of being able to do this with a calculator, which we will also look at in future weeks. But this specific task and video is related to doing it without a calculator. So let's have a look. First of all, a little recap of the word percentage in the first place. So percentage means out of 100 or for every 100. And there are a few ways that you might remember this. And it's all focused around the middle part of the word percentage, which I've drawn in here in red. So the word cent, like you see in the word century, which is 100 years, or centurion, which was a Roman guard who used to have 100 soldiers working beneath them, or cents, as in 100 cents in a dollar. All of those cents refer to 100. So there's a few different ways of remembering that percentage means out of the 100. Okay, we're going to look at the representation of this 100. So here is a grid which represents one whole. Now, don't fall into the trap of thinking that one whole is the biggest you can have. You can always have more than a whole. One whole is on a number line, so is 2 holes, 3 holes, and 4 holes. So this is one whole, and I've split it up into 100 little squares so that each one of these little squares is 1 out of 100. And if it's 1 out of 100, then that makes it 1%. So the bit that I've highlighted now is 1%. And because it means out of 100, it also means 1/100th. So you can write it as a fraction as well. So 1% is the same as 1/100th. So how can we use that to apply it to finding percentages of amounts? Well, let's have a look at these 3 questions. So we're going to look at finding 1% of 400, 3% of 400, and 7% of 400. Just to make life more straightforward, I've set that out in a table, but you don't have to do that. Right, I'll move this out of the way. Okay, so we need 1% of 400. And to get 1% of 400, well, that's like saying that this big square on the right, this square here that I've drawn, the whole thing represents 400, and I want to know what this one little square is. If the whole thing's 400, and I know there's 100 little squares in there, then if I count these all up, it has to make 400 when I add it all together. So I know there's 100 of them. If each one was worth 1, then when I counted it all up, that would be worth 100. That's too small. If each one was worth 2, then with 100 of them, altogether there'd be 200. But I want it to be worth 400. So each one of these little squares must be worth 4. If this was worth 4, then this top row would be worth 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28, 32, 36, 40. The whole top row would be worth 40. The next row would also be worth 40, so that's 2 40s, which is 80, 120, 160, 200, 240, 280, 320, 360, 400. So each little square is worth 4. I can write it in like that. 1% of 400 is 4. If I want 3%, well then I need to know what all 3, including the very first one that I shaded, all 3 that I've shaded together are worth. And we know that each one's worth 4, so I've got 3 4s there. 3 4s is 12, so 3% of 400 is 12. And 7%, well, I can do the same thing again. 4 squares, 5 squares, 6 squares, 7 squares. Each of those is worth 4. So that's 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28. So 7% of 400 is 28. Another way I could have done that is to say if I've got 1% and I want 3%, I need to multiply it by 3. So I'll multiply this by 3. If I've got 1% and I want to find 7%, I need to multiply it by 7. So I'll multiply this by 7. But the first trick, the first and most difficult part of that is finding the 1% in the first place. Okay, let's look at a similar question. Okay, first of all, I've got my 100 grid again, which is going to help me to represent percentages because, of course, 100% represents a whole. This time the questions are to find 10% of 400, 20% of 400 and 70% of 400. And remember that 10% means 10 out of 100. So if this square has 100 pieces, then 10% is 10 of them. So here's 10 of them. Now you can see that those 10 can be repeated. So I could have the same 10 over here, or here, or here. And if I have 10 of them, 10 of those 10s, then I get the whole 100. So, and we know that in this question, the whole 100% is going to represent 400. And that's always a useful thing to start off writing, even though you know it. So I'm always going to start by writing up what is 100%. And 100% in this question is 400, like in the previous question. And we're being asked what 10% is. So you can probably pause the video and have a go at this question yourself if you want, before seeing how I do it. And so for those of you that have paused the video, hopefully you've now finished and you've come to watch how I do it. So I started this off and said, well, the blue bit that's highlighted is 10%. And I mentioned that 10 of those 10% will make the 400, which means that one of them must be 40. Because we know that if we count up in 40s 10 times, we'll get to 400 on the 10th one. So we'd have 40, 80, 120, 160, 200, etc., all the way up to 400 on the last occasion. So 10% is 40, which means 20%, well, that's just a case of highlighting 2 columns instead of 1. And we know that the first column was worth 40, so this column is also worth 40. And if this column's worth 40, then together, both columns are worth 80. And then we can do exactly the same thing for the 70%. We'll need 7 columns in total, so in fact, let's shade it a bit quicker. So we've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns. So I'll shade all of this in. And I know that each of those columns is worth 40. And so, oh, actually I've not done enough. I've only done 6 columns. Oh no, I've done 7. I just haven't written in the last one. My apologies, that's because of my bad shading. Should have done a bit more right up to the edge. There we go, 7. Okay, so we've got 40, 80, 120, 160, 200, 240, 280. So 70% is 280. Again, without the diagram, you can do exactly the same thing. First work out 10%. Easiest way was to say, well, I need 10 tens to make 100. So I'm dividing 100% by 10. So I also divide the 400 by 10 to get 40. Then I can use 10%, and all I did really was double the 10% to get 20%. So I doubled the 40 to get 80. And I won't write it in because I think it'll be too messy, but to get from the 10% to the 70%, I have to multiply by 7. 7 lots of 10% is 70%, so 7 lots of 40, which is 280. Okay. Here's another one. 50% and 150%, and as always I'm going to start with 100% and I'm going to try and use it to find 50% and 150%. Now this time, if you would like to pause it before I even get started, then pause now and then come back and have a look after you've had a go at the question. So 50% would be 5 columns of 10, so that's going to be there. Again, I'll highlight the 5 columns and I could shade those in. It's not the neatest shading, but I'm sure you get the idea. And you can see there's a couple of ways of thinking about this. We know from the last question that this column is worth 40, so I've got 5 columns of 40. So I could do it like that. I could add up 5 40s, or I could say, well, actually looking at the diagram, I can see that this section that I've shaded here is half of the whole thing. And so this must be half of 400, which is 200. So whether I do it as 5 lots of 40 or I do it as half of 400, I get 200 either way. And now the question is 150%. Now I can't show this on the diagram because it's more than the entire whole, it's more than the 100%. But it doesn't mean that you can't have it. And there's a couple of ways we could do it. We could think about how many 50% we need to make 150%, which is 3. So I could multiply the 200 by 3, which gets me 600. Or another way I could do it would be to say that 150% is the total of 100% and 50%. So if I add these two together, then I get 150%. So if I add 400 and 200 together, I'll get the right answer, which is 600. Okay, so that's 2 ways you could do that question. Some people think that you can't have more than 100%. I'll give you one example of how you could. Imagine I got paid £400 per week and then was given a 50% pay rise. Then my new salary would be £600 per week, which is a 50% increase, which means that I would now be paid 150% of what I was being paid before. Okay, so it is possible to have more than 100%, just means more than one whole. Okay, on we go. So now we're looking for 25% and 75%. Again, there's 2 ways of doing this, and I'll go through both ways. To find 25%, I think the way that most people would do that would be to say 25% would be half of half, because 50% would be the first 5 columns all shaded. So if I went right down to the bottom, but if I didn't go right down to the bottom, if I stopped halfway down, then that would be 25%, because I need 4 25% to make the whole 100%. So I could say that's a quarter. So you can see from the diagram I've shaded a quarter. So this must be 100, because a quarter of 400 is 100. I need 4 100s to make 400. So that's one way. Another way would be to shade it over here, 25%. So we know from earlier that 10% was 40. So that's 40 and 40. And then if the whole column is 40, then half of the column must be 20. And you can see here that I've shaded 10, another 10 with this column. So that's 20, and here's 5. So in total in green, I've shaded 25%. And so if I add these up, then I should get the same thing. 40 add 40 is 80, 80 add 20 is 100. So exactly the same as what I had previously. And then, like we did earlier, once you've got 25%, easiest thing to do would probably be to multiply it by 3. Because 3 lots of 25 is 75. And so 75% of 400 is 300. Okay. So we're going to move on in a moment, but first have a go at this question. I've changed the number from 400 to 600, so have a go at this. I've started you off by labelling 100% as 600. You could use a diagram with a set of squares on it if you need to, or you could just do it without the squares if you feel confident to do that. Pause the video, have a go, and I will go through it in just a moment. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to have a go at that question. The way I would do this is to say, well, 10% would be 60. And I know that because I need 10 columns to make 100%, and each column would have to be worth 60. And so if I want 70%, then I'm going to need 7 lots of this. So I'm not going to shade it all in, but I am going to need 7 of them. So there's 7. And if I add this all together, so this is really 7 lots of 60. So if I know my 60 times tables, which I do, 60, 120, 180, 240, 300, 360, 420. So 70%, which I found by multiplying my 10% by 7, would be 420. Okay, now we're going to use a similar process to find 15%. Again, if you think you can do this already, then pause the video and have a go. And for those of you that have had a go, hopefully you got the right answer, and I will go through now what you should have got. So don't forget, we should always start with 100% and label what that is. So 100% is 600. We need 15%, so I'll shade in 15% to show what I'm doing. Here's 10%. And here's 5%. So that's 15% that I've shaded all together. Now, from the last question, you should already know that 10% would be 60. So if I were to shade this whole column in, this would be 60 as well. But I'm only shading in 5 parts, so 5%. And 5%, I'm sure you can see from the diagram, that 5%, which is this bit here, is half of the 10%. You can see that they're the same amount in both parts there, the shaded and unshaded parts. So, if it's half of the whole 10%, then 5% can be found by halving the 10%. And if I halve 60, which was the 10%, then I get 30. So if I want 15%, I've got 2 different methods I could use now. I could either say, well, 3 lots of 5% would get me 15%. So I could multiply this by 3. And therefore I could multiply this by 3. 3 multiplied by 30 is 90, so that's one way of doing it. Or another way of doing it would be to say that to get 15%, I could add 10% and 5% together to get 15%. So I'll add the 60 and the 30, and I'll get 90. Okay, so either way, perfectly acceptable. Here's another question. It's slightly more difficult now. Again, if you think you could have a go at this, pause the video and have a go on some paper, and then come back to check whether you did it the same as me. Okay, hopefully you've had an attempt at that. I'll start, as I would always recommend, with 100%. This is of £600, so I need my pound sign in there. I need 17.5%, so I'm going to build that up. So it's more than 10%, so I'll shade my 10% in. A moment ago we did 15%, so let me just shade 15 to start with. Now, I've shaded 15%, I need 17.5%, so I need another 2.5%. Now I could shade that here, I could do that, there's 2.5%, or actually what I'm going to do is shade it in here. So there's the 2%, and I need to stop here at 2.5%. And what's important here is to notice that this is half of this section here. And don't forget that we already know that this is half of this section here. and we know that this full section is 60. So we know that the part that's shaded on the next column is 30, and this is the important bit, this part that's shaded here is half of this bit, because two of them that are the same size make up the whole thing. So this part must be 15. So I've got 10%, which is 60, 5%, which is 30, 2.5%, which is 15, and if I add these three together, 10 add 5 add 2.5 is 17.5%. And so adding these three together, 60 add 30 add 15, I should get 17.5%. We just did 60 add 30 on the last page, that's 90, and add on 15 will get me to 105. And don't forget that this was a money question, so I would have to write £105. Okay, worked example 3, 62.5% of 300 metres. Pause the video and have a go if you think you can, and then unpause it to see me doing it. Okay, hopefully you've had a go at that question. I'll start as I always start by writing down what 100% is, and in this question it's 300 metres. And this time we want 62.5%, so we need 4. I'll start off with those 5 columns, and I'll explain why I'm doing 5 in just a moment. So there I've shaded 50%. Now we want 62.5%, so we need this column as well. That will get me to 60%. And now we still need another 2.5%. And 2.5% we just did a moment ago. There's 2%, and there's an extra half. And don't forget, I'm just going to do this in a different colour over on the side. Don't forget that that 2.5% is half of this 5% that I've just drawn in. Now, I'm just going to start off by looking at this 10% here. This is 10% of 300, so that's 30. Now here I've got 50%. Now there's two ways I could work out 50%. I could do 5 30s and add them together. 30 add 30 add 30 add 30 add 30 is 150. So those together would be 150. Or I could say that 50% is half of the whole thing. And so if the whole thing is 300, then half of it is 150. So that's two different ways of getting the 50%. And we already had the 10% written down, that's this 10% over here. So now we just need this 2.5%. To work out the 2.5%, I'm first going to write down what the 5% is. And this 5% over here is half of this 10%. And we know from over here that 10% is 30, so 5% must be 15. And we also know that this 2.5% here is half of this 5%, which we've just worked out is 15. So that's half of 15, which is 7.5%. Sorry, 7.5. Or 7.5, half of 15. So 2.5% is 7.5. And now, as with earlier, if I add all those together, you can see that on the left-hand side, I'm going to get 62.5%. And on the right-hand side, if I use column addition, I could put these in to help me. I get 5, decimal point in the 7, 5 add 3 is 8, and the 1, so 187.5, And don't forget that this was in meters, so I need to write the M in there. Okay, hopefully you got that. Final example, 35% of 270 kilograms. So this time my whole is 270 and I need 35%. So I'll start off by shading my 30%. And I'll shade in my 5% as well. And so here's 27 because it's 10%, another 27 and another 27. So 100% was 270 kg. 10%, well, to find 10% I divided by 10. 27. I need 3 of those. And I also need 5%. 5% is half of this whole column. The whole column is worth 27, and I need half of 27. Half of 26 is 13, and half of 28 is 14. So this must be 13.5. Okay, you might need a bit of time to just think about how I work that out. So I'll say that again. Half of 26 would have been 13. Half of 28 would have been 14. So half of 27 must be exactly halfway between, so 13.5 or 13.5. So 5%, which I got by halving 10%, is 13.5. And if I add these 3 together, I'm going to get 35%, because 10 add 10 add 10 add 5 is for 35. So I just need to add these 4 values together. Again, if it helps me, I can put in the 0.0 on each of these and use my column addition. So I'll get a 5 in the decimal place. I've got 3 7, so that's 21, add 3 is 24. Carry the 2 across, so I've got 2, 4, 6, 7, and the 2 that I carried, so that's 9. So 94.5, and don't forget this was in kilograms. Okay, on to the final worked example. So this time 135% of £500. Now, a useful way to think about ones which are bigger than 100% is to think, well, I know that 100% is £500. I'm after 135%, so if I can find 35%, I just need to add this amount onto it, because that will get me the 100%. And so really all I need is the method I used on the last page to get 35%. So I'm going to do exactly the same method. So there's my 30% so far. Still need to shade 5 more percent, which I haven't done. Let's try again. So there's 35% shaded. My apologies, can't count. 35% shaded now. And the whole thing was 500, which means each 10% must be 50. And again, this 5% is half of the 10%, so that's 25. So if I want 135%, I'm going to use 3 10% and a 5%. 3 10% are 50 each. 5% is 25. So I'm going to add all of those together. And this on the left will give me 135%, which is good news because that's what I've been asked for in the question. And on the right hand side, the units column gives me 5. The tens column, 5, 10, 15, 17. So I'll put down the 1 and carry the 100 across. Sorry, put down the 70 and carry the 100 across. So that gives me £675, 135% of £500. Okay, well that concludes all of the questions. So now you can have a go at understanding how to find percentages of amounts by applying your knowledge of finding 10%. And the way you're going to do that is on Hegarty. You're going to attempt task 84 and 85. You should be able to have a go at both of those. And if you do get stuck and you need yourselves an unstuck, then you could use Mr. Hegarty's video to go through it all again. Okay, bye for now, and I'll see you on the next task.